History is an incredibly fascinating and mysterious science that holds many secrets and raises a lot of questions. However, many forget that history is often an inexact science around which, with the support of mass culture, a huge number of myths are created. Everyone considers them true, but they have no connection with the events that happened. In this video, Top F will talk about 5 such myths. And before we start, support my channel with your like and subscription. Also, turn on notifications to catch all the new releases. Get ready to be shocked. We start. Myth number 1. Egyptian pyramids were built by slaves. In the minds of most citizens, the myth is alive that huge masses of slaves were involved in the construction of the pyramids in ancient Egypt. Although this myth was refuted relatively recently, I think that much of the knowledge outlined in school history textbooks remembers pictures and descriptions of the construction of these gigantic tombs for the pharaohs. Dying skinny slaves are trying to drag huge blocks. They are constantly beaten with a whip, and the mortality rate is huge. The history of the emergence of false ideas about the use of slaves. Information that slaves were used in the construction of the pyramids comes from the story described by Herodotus. And he also increased the data by about 10 times, telling about 100,000 slaves. The fact is that in ancient Greece, slavery flourished too. Herodotus by default meant the construction of architectural structures with the active use of slave power. Evidence in favor of attracting free people in construction. Burials. In 1990, a large burial place of people involved in the construction was discovered on the Giza Plateau, as evidenced by the corresponding records. The burial of slaves in such proximity to the tomb of the pharaoh cannot be. More than 600 workers were found in this burial. About 600 smaller graves and 30 larger ones, probably craftsmen, architects, and foremen. Later, another burial was discovered with 43 graves of construction managers. The remains of the buried testify that they received qualified, at that time, medical care. There are traces of healing of fractures and even several successful amputations. And that was about 4,500 years ago. Graffiti in teams of workers. Among the found monuments of architecture, there are premises in which the workers who participated in the construction lived. For leaders, architects, and artisans, separate buildings were allocated in which they lived with their families. There are inscriptions indicating the name of the groups of workers. Groups of workers in their names, mottos use such words as endurance, perfection, and strength. Does this speak of slavery? There are documents showing the competition of construction teams. There are names of brigades in honor of kings. Are disenfranchised slaves worthy of such a name? Like all workers, including artisans and managers, in Egypt, they were paid for their work in the form of food. There was even the possibility of some career growth. The main find of the 21st century. In the area of Wadi al-Jarf, a papyrus was found, which, according to Zahi Hawass, former Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities of Egypt, is the main find of the 21st century. This papyrus belonged to one of the builders who was involved in cutting down building blocks in the Et area. It also describes the creation of a water channel parallel to the Nile and methods for transporting blocks. Also, Zahi Hawass, who has great authority, claims that the construction of the pyramids is the most important national project of ancient Egypt. Participation in it is an honor for the Egyptian inhabitants. And working hired people, usually there were shifts of 3 months, did this at a time when it was not possible to engage in agriculture. Thus, jobs were created that provided the opportunity to feed themselves. Citizens hosting construction sites were exempted, or partially exempted, from taxes. Myth number 2. Ancient sculptures were white. As soon as it comes to antique sculpture, the imagination immediately begins to draw the majestic columns of the porticos and the statues of Athena, Zeus, and other gods, goddesses, and heroes standing between them. Snow-white marble sculptures under a piercing blue sky. This noble monochrome set the tone for all subsequent European sculpture. However, relatively recently, scientists finally found out that the ancient statues were still colored. Moreover, they were not inferior to Asian, Middle Eastern, and African ones in the brightness of colors and richness of the palette, and they owe their impeccable white color only to the past centuries and the sandstorms that flew over them. Already at the end of the 18th century, traces of dyes were found on ancient monuments. The authorship of this discovery belongs to the Frenchman Quatremre de Quincy. People of art and scientists could not come to terms with the loss of ideals, because everything connected with Athens is a kind of symbol, and a snow-white statue with impeccable proportions and perfect facial features is not so much a work of a master as a philosophical category. The hopes of the idealists were not destined to come true. The statues nevertheless turned out to be colored. Much later, researcher Vincent Brinkman and a group of archaeologists, already using modern methods infrared, X-ray, ultraviolet, found paint residues on flawless marble statues. The technique by which the color was searched is called raking light, used to restore the paint layer of paintings and statues. Its essence is that the light of an ultraviolet lamp is directed parallel to the surface being studied, which makes visible traces of pigments, touches, and any mechanical influences on the work. Archaeologist Brinkman set out to show how the sculptures depicting the heroes and inhabitants of the Greek pantheon looked. Of course, no one would allow real statues to be painted, so realistic plaster copies of them were made. For coloring, natural pigments were used, similar to those used in ancient Greece. Scientists also found their composition using modern research methods. So, in particular, on the sculptures found in the Temple of Aphaea in the 60s of the last century, traces of sheet gold, copper green, yellow and red ochre, cinnabar, and copper azure have been preserved. The result was presented in the Munich Glyptothek at the Bunt-Gatter exhibition, and later in other museums around the world, including the New Carlsberg Glyptothek. Myth number 3. Vikings wore helmets with horns. 2 helmets with horns, which were the only archaeological confirmation of the myth that the warriors of Northern Europe wore these dubious items on their heads, date back to the Bronze Age. For a long time, there was an idea in popular culture that the Vikings wore helmets with horns. So where did this myth come from? There is a very speculative assumption that the image of horned warriors appeared during the Christianization of Scandinavia, supposedly for Christian missionaries from the south. The inhabitants of Northern Europe were barbarians. This hypothesis is not confirmed in written sources, so we will move on to more real examples. Most likely, Viking horns first appeared in the 19th century in illustrations for Fridtjof Saga by Esaias Tner, and a little later on the costumes of the heroes of Wagner's opera Nibelungenlied. Costume designer Emil Deppler, of course, had no idea what the Viking helmets looked like. The archaeology of Scandinavia was then not very developed. In 1904, an oak longship was found in eastern Norway. Now it is known to us as the Oseberg boat. This is a warship that was used as a funeral. Before the burial ceremony, the drakkar was decorated with various carvings, including the image of a warrior in a horned helmet. At the same time, archaeologists have not found a single such helmet until a certain point, although there are enough finds of armor. According to them, we can say that the Vikings used frame helmets, Wendel, then spangen helms, and then simple conical ones. There were no horns until 1942. It was then that one Dane found in a swamp, from which he took out peat, fragments of 2 helmets, with horns. At that moment, the find wasn't topical, but after the Second World War, it gave rise to a new wave of images of horned Vikings. The protests of scientists did not bother anyone, however, their position was slightly vague. The fact is that the researchers dated the helmets based on their design, not the most reliable dating, and attributed them to the Bronze Age. Wide range, right? Scientists from Aarhus University, Denmark, conducted an additional study, the results of which are presented in a paper published in the journal Prehistorische Zeitschrift. In 2019, while photographing artifacts, one of the members of the scientific group noticed the remains of birch tar on one of the horns. This made it possible to date based on the decay time of carbon-14 isotopes, a method that is now considered quite reliable. According to him, the helmet was placed in a swamp around 900 BC, long before the Viking Age. In addition, scientists have correlated helmets with finds made in the southeast of Iberia and Sardinia to drawings and figures of people with similar curved horns on their headdresses. All this together places the helmets in the late Bronze Age of Northern Europe, a time when the regular trade in metals and other objects became very common, and foreign ideas influenced the culture of the indigenous peoples. It is possible that the horn theme came to Scandinavia along the sea route from the Mediterranean and along the Atlantic coast, which was used by the Phoenician seafarers for trade after about 1000 BC, regardless of the flourishing Transalpine trade route. There is no evidence that even in the pre-Viking era, helmets were ever used during the war. There are no damages characteristic of battle armor. The authors of the work suggest that the leaders wore helmets as a symbol of power at a time when the region was becoming more politicized and centralized. Myth number 4. The Nobel Prize in Mathematics does not exist because of the betrayal of Nobel's wife with a mathematician. The Nobel Prize is constantly awarded in 5 categories: physics, medicine, chemistry, literature, and world. Next comes the award for achievements in the field of economic sciences, but there the choice of the laureate simply takes place according to the same principles. People wonder why the Nobel Prize is not provided for in mathematics. There is even a well-known myth about the betrayal of Nobel's wife. Was there a wife at all, and how does all this relate to mathematics? A popular explanation for why there is no Nobel Prize in mathematics comes down to the personal life of Alfred Nobel. His wife, a name never mentioned, allegedly cheated on him with the mathematician Mittag-Leffler. He was a promising and intelligent person. He would immediately become the main contender for the Nobel Prize. Therefore, the Nobel did not establish this prize on mathematics. It must be understood that for all the facts of the theory there is no evidence. Mittag-Leffler and Nobel were at enmity. This has not been proven. Nobel's wife or girlfriend or fiancée or mistress cheated on him. This has not been proven. Mittag-Leffler would certainly have received the Nobel Prize. This has not been proven. Alfred Nobel did not like mathematics and did not take it seriously. This has not been proven. Alfred Nobel never married. Already this fact refutes the myth of treason. In some variants, the wife is replaced by the bride and mistress. The story may be related to his relationship with Sophie Hess. There was a love correspondence between them, then Nobel showed himself to be paranoid and a jealous person. But then Nobel even bequeathed her money. In many stories about the life of Nobel, another case is mentioned related to the girl. In his youth, he fell in love with the Danish Anna Desiree. They met in St. Petersburg. She allegedly rejected the Nobel. His first love generally died of tuberculosis. His mother dissuaded him from marrying actress Sarah Bernhardt. The connection of all these women with Mittag-Leffler has not been proven. But in the materials about the life of Alfred Nobel, an unusual case is mentioned. Mathematician Franz Lamarche gave Nobel a mathematical problem on a napkin. Nobel got nervous, refused to solve it, and just left. This has become another reason for theories why the Nobel Prize is not awarded in mathematics. But it could hardly have influenced the final opinion of Nobel. Nobel's biography states that sometimes he was desperately lonely. But Alfred Nobel had a close friend. For more than 20 years he was in correspondence with Bertha von Suttner, maiden name Kinsky. There are even separate books written about it. It is believed that it was she who insisted on the will of Alfred Nobel, where he prescribed the details of the Nobel Prize. She is also behind the establishment of the Nobel Peace Prize, which she received in 1905 for the development of peace movements. Nobel took this woman to work on an ad, but after 8 days she left with her lover for Georgia. Later, she constantly sent letters to Nobel. He consulted with her and discussed the world order and human contribution to the development of science. The Nobel Prize website has a selection of major events from the life of Alfred Nobel. It mentions, among other things, his acquaintance with Bertha von Suttner. This is the only woman who influenced his perception of the world. Already at 42, Nobel called himself an elderly man. He seriously thought about the wedding and relationships only in his youth, then it faded into the background. Bertha von Suttner had nothing against mathematics. Why mathematics is not on the Nobel list? Possible explanations. The Nobel Prize website has a FAQ section. It mentions the official explanation of why there is no Nobel Prize in mathematics, engineering, and other categories. Alfred Nobel clearly outlined only 5 categories in his will. Even the prize in the field of economic sciences was established only in memory of him, and it did not become the Nobel Prize. The same testament states that the Nobel Prize should be awarded to those who have brought the greatest benefit to humanity. Nobel emphasized physics, chemistry, and literature because he showed interest in them from childhood. He saw no real practical use for mathematics. Therefore, he simply did not think that a prize of this level was needed for it. Nobel bequeathed that most of his fortune should be invested in reliable securities. The Nobel Prize is funded from their proceeds. The lack of mathematics is also associated with the fact that the Nobel did not count on a large number of awards. We remind you, the Nobel Prize winner receives a diploma, a medal, and money, now about $1 million. Myth number 5. Nero burned down ancient Rome. The mad emperor Nero, standing on a hill, composes poetry, inspired by the spectacle of burning Rome, set on fire by his order. This story is well remembered even by those who at school were not enthusiastic about the history of the ancient world. 6 days of fire. That's just because his death with a real fire is in no way connected, if only because the emperor of Rome did not set it on fire. The Great Fire of Rome began on the night of July 18/19 AD 64. It was the most terrible in the history of the ancient city, and perhaps one of the most destructive in the history of mankind. Most historians agree that the main fire raged for 6 days. Then the fire engulfed the field of Mars, but there was no more great destruction. It was finally possible to cope with the fire only by July 27th. Of the 14 districts of the city, 4 were completely burned out, and significant damage occurred in 7 more. Luxurious houses, gardens, monuments, the losses of Rome are incalculable. The temple of the goddess of the moon was completely burned down, and the temples of Jupiter, Apollo, and Vesta were very badly damaged. Sacred Street, the main road of the Roman Forum, leading from the capital to the Forum, burned down almost completely. How many people died in the fire is unknown, but there were a lot of victims. Twisted narrow streets did not allow crowded, panicking Romans to escape from the rapidly advancing fire. Slaves, seasonal workers, and illegal residents of Rome, who arrived in search of a better life from other states and regions of Italy, there were very representatives of these categories among the victims. But where does the myth of Nero's guilt come from? Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus wrote most vividly about her. As if he was disgusted by ugly old houses and narrow crooked alleys, he set fire to Rome so openly that many consulars caught his servants with torches and tow in their courtyards, but did not dare to touch them, and the granaries that stood near the Golden Palace and, according to Nero, took up too much space from him, were, as it were, first destroyed by war machines, and then set on fire, because their walls were made of stone. For 6 days and 7 nights disaster raged, and the people sought refuge in stone monuments and crypts. In addition to countless residential buildings, the houses of ancient generals, still decorated with enemy booty, burned, the temples of the gods, erected and consecrated during the years of the kings, and then the Punic and Gallic wars burned everything worthy and memorable that was preserved from ancient times. He looked at this fire from the Maecenas Tower, enjoying, in his words, a magnificent flame, and in theatrical attire, he sang the collapse of Troy. The author of the Life of the 12 Caesars, it should be noted, was born after the Great Fire of Rome and after the death of Nero, so he was not a witness to these events. In addition, the fame of a collector of various gossip and rumors was attached to Suetonius, and much of what he contributed to his book is not confirmed by other sources. Another thing is that not only Gaius Suetonius accused Nero of arson, but the motive was called purely practical, not related to versification. The emperor wanted to clear Rome of slums to build it up with new buildings. Not a destroyer, but a savior and creator? But in the case of the fire in Rome, as mentioned above, not only the slums were burning, but also the richest areas. But Trastevere, then considered one of the most terrible areas of Rome, did not suffer at all. The fire began in the shops located on the southeast side of the Circus Maximus and quickly spread throughout the city, affecting the palace of Nero himself. The emperor was a great lover of values, and it is completely unclear why he would harm himself. The most interesting thing is that at the time of the start of the fire, Nero was not in Rome at all. A week before, because of the terrifying heat, he had gone to the seacoast, to Antium. For a man who specifically intends to set fire to the city to enjoy the terrible spectacle, Nero behaves illogically. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, who survived the fire of Rome as a child, writes that Nero, returning to Rome, led the fight against fire. For the homeless Romans, he opened his palaces and also did everything necessary to ensure the supply of the city with food and avoid starvation. At the same time, witnesses claimed that the emperor looked shocked these days, while the Romans, on the contrary, welcomed him, appreciating the help he had received. That is, among the common people, rumors about Nero's guilt somehow did not take root. The emperor personally supervised the restoration of the city. Thanks to him, the streets were widened and other measures were taken to avoid a similar disaster in the future. The provinces of the empire were subject to a one-time tax on the restoration of Rome, thanks to which the city was rebuilt very quickly. Publius Cornelius Tacitus in the Annals wrote about this as follows, and so, to overcome rumors, Nero sought out the guilty and betrayed to the most sophisticated executions those who, with their abominations, attracted universal hatred and whom the crowd called Christians. Christ, from whose name this name comes, was executed under Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Suppressed for a time, this malicious superstition began to break out again, and not only in Judea, from where this destruction came, but also in Rome, where everything most vile and shameful flows from everywhere and where it finds adherents. So, first, those who openly recognized themselves as belonging to this sect were captured, and then, according to their instructions, a great many others were convicted not so much of villainous arson, but of hatred for the human race. Their killing was accompanied by bullying, for they were dressed in the skins of wild animals, so that they would be torn to death by dogs, crucified on crosses, or doomed to death in the fire, and were set on fire after dark for the sake of night illumination. Historians, however, note that the work of Tacitus is known in the form of a manuscript of the 11th century, so it was likely amended already at a time when Christianity began to dominate in Europe, and Nero himself was perceived as a vile pagan. Let us remind you once again that the emperor was not in the city at the time the fire began. Christians in Rome at that time were indeed regarded as a dangerous sect. In cases of mass disasters, hysterical citizens often begin to look for the guilty. In one era, they caught witches, and in others, Jews. It is possible that during the Great Fire, ordinary Romans blamed everything on the admirers of Christ they did not understand and began to administer lynching. Nero, having arrived in the city, joined in what was happening, considering it the lesser of the evils. How Nero died. Nero died 4 years after the fire, in June 68. The emperor quarreled not so much with the people as with representatives of the highest aristocracy and the army, tired of his extravagant antics. Faced with the imminent threat of losing power, and life with it, he asked the remaining faithful servants to help him. Dying, Nero, it seems, really said, What a great artist is dying. Interestingly, Nero's death sparked a bitter civil war between the four contenders for the title. This period in history is known as the Year of the Four Emperors. However, this no longer applies to the Great Fire of Rome. Nero, of course, had many sins and crimes, but he most likely did not burn Rome. But the image entrenched in literature is stronger than any historical truth. So the emperor will no longer be able to justify himself, just as the unfortunate Salieri will never be able to justify himself, and in his thoughts, he did not have to poison Mozart. But you will learn about this in another release by Top F. That's all for today, my dear friends. Mr. Top F was with you. Thanks for watching this video to the end. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Also, write down in the comments what topic of the video you want to see in the next release of Top F. Bye.